Okay, so today we're going to go over some rendering settings as well as lighting. So I'm just going to open up a random file. It might already have lights in it, but I can kind of go through rather than modeling something entirely new. Let's go with let's go with this one. That's not a bad one. Okay, so this is basically just a dining room model that I've got here. Right now there's no ceiling or floor on it, and nothing has any materials applied to it. It's all just kind of a gray wash. But that'll be good for just kind of showing lighting, stuff like that. That way the materials don't affect how that all portrays itself. So over here, these are windows in a future model. This is kind of a halfway point model of this room, but in the future these are windows, and this is a door out into a hallway. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to a section view so I can see where my ceilings are at. My ceilings are at 12 foot. So just like in the ceiling tutorial, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to sketch a ceiling, and I'm going to select a couple of these walls. That way I get my ceiling, and I'm going to put it at 12 foot. I'm also going to make sure that my finish is what I want it to be. It's basically just a white painted ceiling, so I should be good there. So say OK, OK, and hit my check mark. Okay, so now I've got my ceiling in there. I'll need a floor as well, so let's put a floor in here. Exact same thing as we did with the ceiling, and I'm going to edit type, edit the structure, and apply a material right here. And I'm going to make it the exact same as the ceiling was. I'm just going to make it a white paint. Obviously my floor wouldn't be a white painted gypsum board, but for purposes of lighting and stuff like that and showing you guys that, it'll work for what we're doing. So okay, so now we got our ceiling and our floor. Now we want to start putting some lights into this thing. So there's a few different lights within Revit that you'll probably use a decent amount. So I'm going to go to level 2, and I'm going to hide these real quick so I can zoom to fit here. Okay, so when I go to level 2, I'm going to have this level 1 underlay on, and the reason I go to level 2 is because I can see my ceiling in this level. I need to be able to see my ceiling so that I can place lights in it. And I always do the level 1 underlay so that way I can see what's going on below when I'm placing my lights. It just helps in laying stuff out to see what exactly you're lighting underneath it. So I'm going to go to component, I'm going to go to load family, and then over here is lighting, architectural, and then I'm inside, so I'm going to go internal. And there's a few different lights here that I'm going to use throughout this thing, so I'm going to load them all in at one time. I'm going to use the under cabinet light, the recessed can, which you'll use a lot of recessed cans. That's your pretty much standard light that you have in your house in the ceiling, just the those circular can light. And then I'm going to load in this studio light. There are a bunch of other types of lights here that you might use. I'll also load in this downlight strip because that might be something that we may want to use. So I'm going to go studio light, and I'll hit open. And load those in. Okay, so now they come in under components, so all of the stuff that's within this model is all already loaded in here, but now I also have these other options that are in here. So I tend to err on the side of I'll go with a 6-inch or an 8-inch can that's the 277 volt. The reason for that is mostly because I'd rather have too much light and be able to dim them than not enough light and have to come in and change my model to something else. So in this instance, since the room is big enough, I'm going to go with an 8-inch can. If 8-inch cans look huge in your ceiling, go to a 6-inch. There's no need to have huge can lights in a room that's fairly small. So I'm going to place a couple lights in here. So I'm going to do kind of a three on this end, and I'll do a couple down the sides. I'll do similar down this side, and then I will do the same configuration on this end as I did on the other. Okay, so I've got my can lights kind of placed within there. Now, actually I'll show you that here in a little bit when we do a little test rendering. Okay, so if I go back to my view here, and I'm going to do a little test rendering to see what this looks like lit up. So if I go to my little teapot down here, I'm going to change this from exterior sun only to interior artificial, because I only want my artificial lights here to render. And then I'm going to change this background style to a color, and I'm just going to make it jet white. And the reason that I want this to be white is so that later in Photoshop I can Photoshop whatever I want into these windows and this door to make it look, the way it should, rather than have Revit try to figure out what a sky is going to be back here. I'll Photoshop my own sky and stuff like that in, and that's just easier to do when it's white. Okay, so if it was on exterior sun, this is grayed out. As soon as I switch to an artificial option, this button comes up. If you click on that artificial lights, you've got all these options here where you can dim individual lights. And as you can see, when I select stuff, whatever light that is, it highlights, which can be useful to know, which light you're actually selecting there. For now, I'm going to leave them all at 1. So I'm going to keep them at full strength until I know where I need to dim, what I need to dim, that sort of thing. Now, just for seeing illumination of the room, I don't go anywhere beyond, say, low. Like, low is a decent setting for just seeing how well lit up a room is. So if I hit render on low, it's going to take all of these lights and it's going to render this. Now, the first 50% is going to be calculating the light itself. The second 50% is going to be the image. So if the first 50% takes forever, that doesn't mean the second 50% is. So, okay. So this looks kind of junky. It's got kind of an orangish cast to it and everything. It's got, my can lights look like they're off, but clearly they're emitting some sort of light. I'm getting kind of a fairly well lit floor, but my walls and stuff like that aren't really, it's getting pretty dark up towards the tops, and overall it's not lighting very well. And I might want to illuminate these a little bit, since those are kind of a feature within the room. Those would be nice to have lit up. So I've got a few things I need to take care of to make this look a little bit better. So if I go back to show model, I'm going to click on one of these can lights, and if I go over to edit type, up here is a material, and you can apply a material to the light itself. So I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to create a new material, and I'm going to name it light bulb. And now if I go over to my render appearance, this little replaces this asset where you go to put in any sort of material that's already in Revit. If I click on that and pull down my appearance library here, under glass there's an option for light bulb on. And if I double click on that, it's going to apply that to it. So I'll hit OK, OK. And now if I render this again, the light quality is not going to change, but now my lights will actually look like they're on. So we'll let this go through. And I will also say, when it gets to 20%, that's further along in the first 50% than you'd think. And I'll explain that again when we render again. But okay, so now we see that now it looks like my lights are actually kind of on. They've got an illuminance to them, and things are looking a little bit better. So now I'm going to go back to show model. I'm going to come back in, and I'm going to hit select all instances in entire project. And I did that kind of quick, so I'll do that one more time. I right click, select all instances in entire project, and that'll select every 8-inch incandescent 277 volt can light in my entire project. Since I just have can lights in this one view here, I can hit entire project and I'm good to go. But this is what I'm going to do. This is something you're going to want to do for every light. So I'm going to hit edit type, and I'm going to scroll down here. Now right here is light loss factor. That's your sort of your dimming. So when you go here, that's the same thing. So I wouldn't adjust anything there. Initial intensity, if you click on that, you can change the wattage and all of that stuff. I would leave it as is. If for whatever reason your model isn't lit up enough, add more lights rather than start messing with the wattage of this. But the big thing here is this one, this initial color. So if I click that, you see how orange this picture is? It's telling you that incandescent light is that color. And incandescent light is that color. That's what it kind of actually is. But our eyes automatically correct that. Our eye automatically realizes that those aren't the actual colors of what, that rose looks like, those flowers. The leaves aren't actually this kind of grayish, orangey color. They're green. So our eye automatically filters that and corrects most of it. So we see more of a white light than what this is actually showing. So I'm going to change this. I don't want my image to look like this. I want it to look more of a white light. So I tend to go with this daylight. And that's a kind of a pure white light. If you want to get really nerdy about it, it's the 6430 Kelvin, which you guys will get into in your ECS classes and stuff later on. But if you want to get really technical about it, this tends to make renderings look nice. That looks great and everything, and that's what I run with 90% of the time. If I'm feeling really finicky about it and everything, I'll come in here and say custom, and I'll change this Kelvin color to, I might back it down a little bit. That way I get a little more color to it. I might back it down to say 6,000, 6,200, something like that. That'll give you a little bit more color to it, and it'll do a slight hue, but that's getting really, really picky about it. So I'm going to change it to just a daylight fluorescent color, the 6430. Now hit OK, OK. And now I'm going to hit this medium so that it takes a little bit longer, and I can show you a few things with the rendering time here. Okay, so instantly it's going to jump to 10% after it kind of figures out how many lights there are. And then the first 20% is these large chunks. So you see these large squares that it's filling in? So that's going to be the next 5% here. 5 to 25%. So it'll probably be right around 25. Okay, and then it starts these small chunks and fills the rest in. Now obviously those big chunks are more than the 25% to get to the 50. So the first big chunks take a little while, and then the second kind of pass is much better. Okay, so here we go. Now this looks a little bit better in terms of lighting. We're still got some dark areas, but it's not orange, which is what we were trying to get rid of. You see these little white flecks here? Those are a matter of just changing your quality, as well as these up here. It's not a very even kind of light there, and you get some kind of junky shadows going on. But that's all stuff that will change here in a little while. Okay, so we've got our color changed. Now we want to start to lighten up all of this other area and maybe get some fill lights in here and really start to kind of accent maybe this back wall over here. So I'm going to go to level 1. I'm going to go back to my component, and I'm going to scroll down and find studio light. And these I would use 120. You don't want 277 because that's going to be a little too much and you're going to get some bright spots. So you're not going to be able to see these because they're placed above your view. So what I'll do is I'm going to click in a couple here, and I'm going to put one in front of each one of these little shell corner cabinets, and I might put one in the middle there, and let's see what that looks like. So now if I go to level 2, I can see kind of where those all are placed, and so I'm going to move this to kind of the middle there. I'll back this up a little bit off of the corner because I don't want to get too close to the shells, and I don't want to be too close to my walls. And I'll show you why that is here in a little bit. I'm going to put that one right underneath that one, and actually let's back it up a little bit. I don't want too much of a bright spot. So let's back this one up, and let's back this one up. Okay, now if I go back to my level 1, I'm going to pull this section view all the way to the wall here and extend the view out so that way I can see this back wall. I'm going to go to view. Now, these are those studio lights that I just placed. So I'm going to select all an entire project, so I've grabbed all of those. Now, I don't want these to be too close to the ceiling or too close to the floor. I want them to be kind of in a mid-range, so I'm going to move them down just a little bit. Not much, but just enough. So that should give me a decent amount, and I've also got a decent amount of light down here by the floor from my can lights. So I'm trying to illuminate the top more than my floor. But in any room, the kind of ceiling up here is going to be slightly darker than it is down by the floor, just from the nature of having can lights and stuff like that. So if I go back to my 3D view, now I can see all of my little orbs floating here. And let's go back to a low setting, and I'll hit render here. Now these, I didn't dim any of these right now, so they're all at kind of full capacity. And you're going to see that this is going to take a little bit longer and a little bit longer to render as the number of lights right here increases. So there's your first pass, goes through, calculates all the light, and then the second pass goes the same speed as before. Okay, now we've got a pretty well lit room here. Maybe a little bit too much. We're getting a pretty even light all over the walls, and we're not getting a whole lot of shadow here and there. But as you can see, I didn't change the color of those studio lights, so we're getting a mixture of the white light and then the kind of slightly orangey light of the studio lights. But those studio lights are not set to incandescent, so they're not near as orange as what these can lights were before. So this mixture gives you a pretty good realistic lighting here. So you get a little bit of orange, but you get mostly the white light, so it starts to look closer to what you actually want. Now, to create a little bit of shadow, you don't want it to be, super well lit. We're not making a Burger King or a Wendy's here. We want something that's got a little bit of moonlight into it. So I'm going to come in and I hit this artificial lights, and all my studio lights here, I'm going to dim. But if rather than punching in a dimming factor for each one of these, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Show Model, and I'm going to select one of these. And apparently you can't do it in that view. So let's go to here. Okay, so once I go to an elevation view, an elevation or a floor plan view, 3D view won't let you do it. But up here, how it says light group, I'm going to pull this down, hit edit new. And over here I'm going to say, okay, I want a new option. And I'm going to call this fill lights. And I'll say, okay. Now I'm going to select all, an entire project. I'm going to select all of my studio lights and apply those to that fill lights group. And it's going to say, you're about to move all of these lights to this group. Are you sure? Okay. And now if I go back to my view and hit this artificial lights, it now has these divided. These are the ungrouped ones, and this is my fill lights group. So if I just punch in, say, 0.7 as a dimming factor, it'll dim all of those. This can be really nice when you get a huge list of these things here. It's hard to remember, if I have studio lights in various places, like maybe I have a couple of things over here and a couple of things back on this side, I would group those separately, so that way okay, those are the ones over here, these are the ones over here, so whenever things are too bright or too dim, you've got that kind of option and you know right where they are, as opposed to scrolling through here and clicking each individual one to try to figure out which light is which. So I'll hit OK, and now I'll render this again. Now all of my fill lights are going to be dimmed to 70% of the light that I had before. So it'll go through its little calculation here, and because it's just the lights that I'm increasing, the second half of this image goes at the same speed as it always did. So there we go. That's getting a little bit better. So we're not bright as day. We've got some shadow here, but we're also not getting super bright spots on the wall. If my fill lights were really close to the sides here, we get a really bright spot because my light is right against the wall. So you want to kind of keep your fill lights away from your ceilings and away from your wall, so you don't get that really bright spot, which you're getting some here, but those are caused by the can light is coming down and it hits a bright spot and then kind of filters out. But we'll correct kind of some of this as we go forward here. So I'm going to go back to show model, and now I'm going to go to this view here, and I'm going to go to that here in a second. First I'm going to place these lights here. So I'm going to go to studio light, and I'm going to come up and I'm going to say under cabinet light, usually 120 will work, and so I can see what this is doing, I'm going to drop this down, say 3 feet, and now it'll show up. Now you see how small that is? I don't want something that small, so if I want something a little bit longer, I can go to, say, a 48 inch, and I'll drop this down so I can see that. So now I've got a nice big downlight here. I'm going to rotate that, and I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to put 2 right next to each other. So now I'm going to go to my level 2, and what I'm going to do is, I see my crown mold running around here. That's what this line is. I want to tuck these 2 lights back in behind here so that I get a nice little light there. So then I'm going to go to level 1, go to this view, and now I need to be able to see where those lights are. I can either kind of put a swath across there and you can see how I'm highlighting those 2. I can do it that way, or I could go in here and hit wireframe and I can see them. So I'm going to move them, and I'm going to move them up and behind this little point right here. So I've got a couple of options here. I'm going to move them right there, and now if I go to my hidden line, they're tucked right in behind this opening here. So now they'll drop down, and they'll give me a nice light kind of coming off of there. So let's go back to my view here, and I'll render that, and let's see what we get here. Those may be too bright, they may not be. So it just kind of depends on how far away it is. The more you do this, the more you'll be able to gauge, like, okay, I'm going to dim that, I'm not going to dim that, that should be fine. And then you'll do a test rendering and you'll be pretty close, and then you can just make final tweaks. You won't have to do 18 test renders to make this look decent. Okay, so we're getting a nice little wash of light out there, which isn't too bad. That kind of highlights it a little bit. We're a little dark at the bottom, but that's not too big of a deal. We might be able to remedy that with a couple other lights out this way, maybe a couple fill lights a little lower. But overall, not too bad. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to select one of those lights, and I'm going to select all instances, and I'm going to change the color of that. So this is a little bit better. So that's not quite as orange, but I'm going to change that to the daylight white too. That way that one area doesn't call itself out as being too orangey. Now, I'm going to go into level 1, and I'm going to load in a light family here. But it's going to be one that I've created, similar to the ones that you guys are creating in class here. So, let's let my hard drive warm up. It's a little too early for it this morning. So Revit families, lights, and let's go with that might not be the best. Let's find something. Yeah, let's go with those. That'll be fine. So it'll update whenever you have. I've made a lot of my families in past versions of Revit, so then when I load them in, it has to update them. But not a big deal. Doesn't take too long to do. So it'll bring that in, and then okay. So I've got my light family, but this is just like I was talking about in class. I don't make my light families lights. I make them as generic models or whatever they want to be. Something random like that, and then I use studio lights so that I have more control over each individual light. So let's say I put 2 chandeliers, and there's going to be a table in the middle of this, but I'm not really too worried about that right now. And I'll hit go to view. Now my 2 chandeliers are down here on the floor, so I'm going to grab both of those, and I'm going to move them up to a certain point and say, okay, those are going to hang maybe a little bit taller than that. Somewhere around in there. Okay, I don't have a kind of cord or any sort of attachment to the ceiling on these particular lights. I can just come in and model in place like a revolve or something like that that comes down and attaches there. Not a big deal. But for now, I'm going to go to level 2 and I'm going to place some lights here. So I'm going to go to component, drop this down, and I'm going to find my studio light again, the 120, and so I can see what I'm doing, I'm going to drop these down, say 5 feet, so that I can see them. And I'm going to place it in the center of each one of these little guys here. So I'll place them there, there, and there. And now I'm going to select all of these, and I'll copy, and I'm going to select a base point somewhere in this this family close to the center, and I'll come over here and copy it over to the same point in this model. That'll work. So now they're pretty much the same. Now, when I go back to my section view, my lights are all the way up here, so I'm going to highlight all of those and move them down from the center, and I'm going to place them within like right in line with my shades and everything there. So now if I go back to my 3D view, I've got a couple of chandeliers here. These are all gray and everything. If I were to make the shades translucent, then that'll help illuminate a little bit. And actually, let's go ahead and do that. That way we get the right light here. So let's change our shade. Let's create a new family. Rename this chandelier shades. And I'm just going to change the color of these. Let's change these to, maybe we'll just do a light gray, so it matches the gray depressing surroundings that are in here right now. We're not going to have glossiness, but we are going to have a transparency. I'm going to set my transparency to something low, like a 15. That way I'm not seeing all the way through it, but then my translucency, I'm going to go up to like an 80. That way I get some light passing through that. And I'll say OK, and it'll apply that material there. Okay, now let's go back to our section here for a quick second, and I'm going to highlight and select all of these lights here again, and I'm going to select the same thing over here. Oh, I'm getting too much of that, so let's highlight those. Okay, now I'm going to make these, I'm going to put these under another light group, so I'm going to call these chandeliers. I'll say OK. OK, and it deselected those on me, so I'm going to go back and select those again, select those again. Same thing over here. And I'll put those under chandeliers. Okay, yeah, I want them in there. So now, when I come under my render options, I have the option of dimming just my chandeliers. Now, I don't want all of those. There's a ton of lights there really close. So I'm going to get a really bright spot on the floor and ceiling above and below those. So I'm going to dim my chandeliers down to like a 0.5 since there's so many lights right there in close proximity. So 0.5 might work, we'll see. But now I'll hit render again, and we'll see what we've got here. And some of this light will also help brighten this dark section there that we had before. So that's why I wasn't too worried about it, because I knew we were going to be adding some more light out in the room that'll hopefully filter over that way. So we'll let this kind of go through its steps. You see it's taken a little bit longer. Now we've got 31 lights in here as opposed to we started with like 10. So this is taking a little bit longer to go through the motions and figure this out. If your computer is taking a long time to do this, just switch from low to draft, and that'll decrease your time a decent amount there. So almost to the fast part. One more little block there, and there we go. Okay, so now it should speed things up a little bit. And you see, for the most part, what I'm using are just those kind of 3 types of lights there. And I'll also show you when using these chandeliers, now I can dim each individual light on those chandeliers. So if I need to, I can dim, individual pieces of it. If I'm getting if I'd like to have it brighter on this side, so that way, I might get rid of more of that dark shadow, I could dim, this half of a chandelier, but not the other half. That would give me a little bit better look. So little things like that. So I'm getting some little splotchy kind of lights up above here, but that's kind of what happens in real life anyway. You get some bright spots because you've got a bunch of lights down below. But overall, it's not too bad. I'm getting some glow from my shade and all of that, so it's looking decent. Not too bad. The only thing that's missing is my materials that actually make this look halfway decent. So now that we've got kind of most of our lights and stuff in here, now let's say we've got this to the point where we actually want to render this thing for the final one. So I'm going to go to show the model, and I'm going to click the outside of my image here. I'll go to size crop. Now this is the size of the image that this is here. At 100%, this is my size. So I'm going to go to scale, and I'm going to change this. Maybe I want an 8.5 by 11 image, so I'm going to hit 11 inches here, so that the largest dimension is 11, and it's going to automatically proportion this so that it's 11. Now it's 7 3/4. If you keep it on this, it's just going to expand these edges out to the sides and up, and that's not necessarily what you want to do. You've already framed the view how you want it, so you just want to scale it so it gets larger. The height here, it's going to fit on an 8.5 by 11, so I'm not too worried about the height as long as I'm maximizing one dimension of the 8.5 by 11. There's no sense in me dragging this down further or up further. All I'm getting is more ceiling and more floor, which I don't really need. So I'll hit OK. And now I'm going to change to a printer. And if I change to printer, I have these options here. 150 DPI isn't bad. That's perfectly reasonable if if you want to go with that. That's okay. If you jump up to 300 DPI, it's double the DPI, so it's going to take twice as long to render. So if 150 DPI goes great, you render at 150 DPI, it goes real quick, maybe takes an hour or two. You could bump it up to 300 DPI and render it overnight, and then you'll get a much cleaner, kind of nicer image. I tend to render all of my stuff at 300 dpi so that when I print it out on photo printers and stuff, it looks really nice. But for now, I'm going to leave it on 150. I've already set my artificial lights when I was doing my dimming and setting all of that stuff, and doing my test renders there. Now it's a matter of getting a better image than this. So this is really junky, and I'm not getting the detail out of this. It's really kind of blotchy, and that's just because of this render setting. Now, instead of going to medium or high or best, those are just going to increase your render time, and yeah, you'll get a better image, but some of the stuff that it's increasing and giving you a better rendering out of, it's also increasing your time, and it's rendering for something that you don't necessarily need. So I'm going to go to Edit, and I'm going to go to Medium. Medium's not a bad setting as kind of a base. So I'm going to go to Copy to Custom, and now I've got all these options here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down through, and I'll tell you what each one of these does. This family doesn't have everything in it, or this model, so I'm going to tell you what each one of these does, but I'm not going to show you what it does because it would take forever to render each individual thing and show you the differences. But these two images on either side of each option give you a pretty good idea. So image precision, very top. This is one of the most important. This is, I'm getting, I don't have a very clean image here. You see how choppy all of this is along the side? I want that to be a little cleaner. That's what this is. And so you see the image on the left, it doesn't have nice smooth round surfaces, it's kind of junky, but on the right it is. So I'll up this. 7 is probably about as low as I would go. At 6 you really start to see the image start to deteriorate. Never go to a 9 or a 10. It's diminishing returns, and this will increase your render time a decent amount. And this will increase the second half of that rendering time. So from 50 to 100%, this is causing your render times to be substantially longer. So if I go to 8, 8's about as high as I'll usually go, because this is exponential. As I go to 8, it might take my computer, say, 6 hours to render on an 8. If I go to 9, it's going to take 14 or 12 or something like that. It's going to take a huge amount more, and for not that much better of an image quality. So I'm going to stick with an 8 or a 7. So depending on how much of a hurry you're in, you might go with a 7. Okay, so reflections and transparency options, these tend to not increase your render time all that much unless you have a lot of glass or shiny surfaces. So maximum number of reflections, you can crank these up a whole bunch. I would keep this down, you might keep this at around, say, a 15, something like that. That's not gonna take too much render time, if at all. And basically what that's doing is it's giving you a better reflection off of it. And then the precision down here for your reflection is going to show you a better quality reflection. So this shows you more reflections, so you're getting more kind of objects reflected in there. And then the precision is, so this is kind of junky, you're not getting a real clean image there, but on this side you're actually getting a much kind of more accurate reflection. And that's going to be something that increases your render time a little bit. So if you up that by maybe 1, that should help. It's not something you're going to notice a lot, though. If your reflections are just a little bit off, unless it's a mirror or something like that, you're not going to notice. And mirrors tend to not be affected too much by this. So same with refractions. If you leave it on the default, you should be fine. Same with the precision. I tend to not adjust those much at all in that section. Shadow options, that will start to kind of clean up your shadows. So if you get a shadow that's kind of got a real grainy texture, so if you look real close, this shadow right here on the floor, you see how it's kind of blotchy? That's this soft shadow precision here. And you'll see how smooth this shadow is on this side and how grainy it is here. I'll increase this to, say, maybe a 6. If you're still having problems, you can up it to a 7, but I wouldn't go much further than that. The 5 and 6 usually resolve it. And what you may do is render something on medium first, so that you see what your shadows look like on the medium settings and you know what to change. If your shadows here look good and they're not blotchy on medium, then there's no need to increase this, because this is going to increase your render time as well. And you know how when you click that drop down, you go from low, medium, high, best? It's increasing all these settings across the board. So if you go to high or best, this is increasing when really maybe your shadows aren't looking any better from the 5 that it defaults to, but you're increasing your render time for something that you're getting diminishing returns on, and you're not going to see a difference. So that's your shadows. Next is your kind of lighting, and this affects your first half, but it also will impact how your image looks overall. So these little white flecks and kind of the blotchiness of light, that is your smoothness here. Now, I would caution you, do not increase these kind of willy-nilly. This increases your render time substantially. So if I increase this 1, it's going to increase my render time a decent amount. So I would leave this alone if your lights look decent. If not, sometimes you'll get some lighting that you get a whole bunch of these little white flecks, and that usually comes with when you've got something that's real shiny. You'll want to increase this a little bit. I wouldn't go beyond, say, a 6. If you still have the little white flecks, then in drastic circumstances you might go to a 7, but I wouldn't go beyond a 6, and most times I won't mess with this at all. Because a couple of these little white flecks, that's not too big of a deal, and it'll also resolve itself a lot of times with increasing your image precision. So those are those. The bounces and the precision, that's something that you can increase if you want to, though they will increase your render time. But as you can see, this is kind of a little more illuminated, but it's going to create a more precise shadow, that sort of thing, but tends to not be too big of a deal. This is a little drastic in terms of the difference from one to the other, and there's no reason to crank that all the way up. That'll get your render times astronomically large. But then bounces is also just a matter of how many times does it calculate the light bouncing around the room, which can give you a little bit more accurate image, but also increases render time. And this isn't too bad. Looking at this image, that's not terrible in terms of how the light's bouncing around, so I'll leave that at, say, a 2. Now, these daylit portal options, don't worry about those right now. Leave those off. If we have time at the end of the semester, I'll come back to those and we'll get into that. But for now, go ahead and leave those off. There are very specific instances where those are good and where they're just useless. So I'll hit OK, and now I've got my custom view settings, and I can go ahead and hit render, and it'll come out a nice pretty image of what this is going to look like. So rather than, it'll take an hour or so for it to render that image, so I'm not going to bother doing that right now, but I will show you what the final image, once I rendered and I put material and stuff like that to it, the final image of these looks something like that. Now this looks really bright in here, and the reason it's really bright is because our printer prints a little bit darker than whatever you see on screen, so they're just a little overly saturated. But for the most part, they turned out okay. There's a few things that, looking back on them, I would change. So see how intense this kind of flower of light is above there? I would definitely go back and change that. But obviously I was in a little bit of a hurry when I was doing these and went ahead and just left that as is. But for the most part, when you show somebody an image like this, they don't tend to gravitate towards that sort of stuff. They're looking from here down. So overall, it's not too bad in terms of lighting, but as I said, it's brighter than it actually would be if I was trying to create, an image that actually looked, really nice. And you can also see there's some of this white sort of splotchiness here. That's something that could be fixed if I increase my image precision and little things like that. Also, you can go back. When I zoom, that look, but when I print something out on the printer, you're not going to see that because the ink kind of bleeds a little bit, and it should all look just fine. Something precise. At some point, I may just sort of, clean so they don't look. It doesn't turn out too bad, and that's also render settings. So if you have questions on any of that, feel free to shoot me an email or just ask me in class.